speaking from King County Metro about the 10-year plan. And Carrie, could you, before you start in with your presentation, could you give us an introduction, a more in-depth introduction than I'm able to do to yourself and the talk?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thanks very much for the invitation. So my name is Carrie Lee, I use she, her pronouns. I'm King County Metro Transit Sustainability and Climate Program Manager. And so that means at a staff level, I support the folks who are directly implementing our work to address climate change and make sure that our leadership, which is the topic of today, and our policy and strategic direction line up with our values. And I'm joined here tonight by my colleague, Stephanie Pure, who's on our government relations team. And so Stephanie, if you want to just say hello.
Hey, I'm Stephanie Pure. Hello. Hi. I'm Stephanie Pure. Yes, and thank you for that great introduction. I'm excited to be here with you all, and grateful we were invited, and we're looking forward to a great conversation. And just also on a complete side note, I am also a 43rd PCO. So, just wanted to throw that out there, and it's nice to see some familiar faces. And thank you, Arvia and others, for inviting us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation tonight. I'm going to flip over the presentation, but what I'm going to share with you tonight is a little bit about our Metro's sustainability and climate priorities and how we're thinking of what it's going to take to address this challenge. And then specifically zero in on how we are incorporating our climate commitments in the policy updates that Metro is engaged in right now that have gone to King County Council and the Regional Transit Committee that we're hoping are adopted by the end of this year or the beginning of next year. And I've been told that this group likes to dig into the details. So I have a few more figures and chart in this figure, and I have some kind of behind the scenes if you want to go there. So I'm willing to be a little bit, we can adjust, but I want to kind of give you the big picture, broad brush to start, and then depending on interest and direction. And so I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay, and once I do that, I don't know that I'll be able to see the chat or folks, so please feel free to, I can see a few people. Anyway, give a shout, or maybe Stephanie or Arvia, you could help me if there's something that's come up that people want to ask about.
For sure.
Thanks. So yeah, this is what we're here today. So I want to give you an overview of Metro's climate commitments and these specific policy updates, and how Metro's engagement and commitment in the countywide strategic climate action plan is informing these policy updates. So Metro's policies, they guide our actions. So there's 3 policies that we're in the midst of updating right now. Our strategic plan, which sets the goals and measures and strategies for the next 10 years. Our service guidelines, which guide how we specifically make decisions about service in the near term. And Metro Connects, our longer range plan. And these are really policies that help carry out our mission. They guide our actions, make sure that we're monitoring our progress towards our commitments. They guide day-to-day decisions, but also in the long term. And it's critical to us that our policies are developed in collaboration with community, reviewed, revised. And in this case, these policies are going to the Regional Transit Committee and the King County Council in the adoption process. And why are we updating our policies? Metro really sees mobility as a human right that allows communities and individuals to access the opportunities they need to thrive. We know that there are historical and racial disparities that affect all of us and our ability and our folks in our region to be able to live well and thrive. And we also know that climate change threatens our economy and our environment, our health and safety. And it's our commitment to make sure that our mobility services help support a livable community, robust economy, and sustainable environment. And so really guided by our desire to make sure that our policies align with our priorities and the values of our region, Metro began work around our mobility framework, but really around how do we center equity and climate in our climate priorities and meeting the needs of our region in terms of growth, both in terms of jobs and folks that are coming to our region. So really it's with this equity and climate lens that has driven our policy updates. Oh, okay. And one of the ways that our Metro's policies have been updated is around climate change, as I said. And at the county level, Metro participates and co-creates our countywide strategies around climate. And King County recently updated our countywide climate plan, which is called a Strategic Climate Action Plan. And its work is in 3 areas. One around how are we reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and there are specific targets at the countywide and in our own government operational levels. And then leading with climate equity. And this was really a new part of our climate plan about how are we centering frontline communities, those that are at the forefront of experiencing the impacts of climate change. How are we building relationships and solutions that really build upon the opportunity and make sure that those communities bearing those impacts are part of and ensure the opportunities of adapting, leading, and thriving in a changing climate. And also, how are we preparing our region for climate impacts? We know that some impacts are baked in, and we need to prepare to increase the resilience of King County communities to climate change. So I know you guys want to sort of see the numbers and how we get there. So this is what we call a wedge, or sort of the pathway of how do we achieve the overarching goals, countywide goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And what you see here is a chart of thousands of metric tons of CO2 over time. So going back to 2005 and out to 2050. And what this figure shows is both historical emissions over the past 10 years. And you can see they've been fairly flat with a little bit of a downturn, and compares to what would happen if emissions were to chart and track with our kind of quote unquote business as usual as population in our region increases, that status quo, and you see how there would be that steady increase over time. And King County has established overall goals to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2000 compared to 2007 and 2030, and by 80% by 2050. And we did analysis to inform how we would develop our specific strategies around these different pathways. And you can see the pathways fall into different buckets. Those related to building energy use, those related to transportation, related to refrigerant gases and electricity supply. And the good news is, and this chart is due to be out, is really now updated after last year's Washington State legislative session, but the pathways are the wedges that are solid lines are those that are already established by adopted policies. So the state clean energy law, 100% clean energy is a sizable portion of our emissions. Existing building energy codes, for example, and federal vehicle efficiency standards. Today, we're going to really zero in on transportation, and I'd be happier to have a colleague come back if you're interested in kind of thinking about one of the other sectors. So what we at Metro are really charged with is thinking about this wedge number 5, which is around reducing car trips. So the goals and commitments that we've focused in developing the county plan and how those are embedded into our own policies is how are we reducing car trips at the countywide level, and also in our operations, reducing emissions from our vehicles. And other good news since this was adopted is wedge 6, adopt a clean fuel standard, is now something that has happened at the state level. So this could now be a solid line, but those are the transportation sector is what we're zeroing in on. So just taking a look at, so what does this mean for Metro, and what are our specific commitments? And what will Metro do in it? So what's Metro committed to doing at the county-wide level? So on the one hand, Metro contributes to county governmental operations, but we have a key role in reducing community vehicle emissions. And so our climate action plan, and as we get to it, the strategic plan, sets specific targets for reducing emissions through sustaining and increasing ridership from transit, specific goals around reducing car trips or reducing vehicle miles traveled in passenger and light trucks, and encouraging dense, affordable housing near transit. And in our operations, Metro is committed to reducing fleet emissions through our transition to a zero emission battery electric bus fleet, with our trolley fleet, reducing facility energy use, emissions, and waste commitments, such things as eliminating all new natural gas in our in facilities, and building green and equitable infrastructure in our operations. And how we're going to do this is Metro is committed to community-driven policymaking, working with community in developing strategies and commitments, and partnering to get the work done, equitable, inclusive pathways to green jobs, and preparing for climate disruptions. And in particular, the policy updates that I'm going to speak about tonight were developed and co-created with the King County Metro Mobility Equity Cabinet, which was a group of 23 leaders representing riders and communities that historically are not a part of or centered in policymaking process, low and no income populations, people of color, Indigenous people, immigrants and refugees, and folks representing limited English speaking communities and people with disabilities. And really, this group identified, I think, challenges that we all see in our region, that, as housing costs have gotten more increased, folks are being pushed further away from the high capacity transit that they need and want to be able to be connected to opportunities. And as our system and as our region grows and changes, and certainly as we've seen in the pandemic, shift from mobility that focuses on weekday and peak service to meeting the needs of folks at different times of the day and less traditional work hours. So I'm going to focus on these specific Metro policies, the strategic plan, which sets for the next 10 years the goals and strategies and objectives and how we'll meet them. Metro connects the long range plan for service and capital improvements, and the service guidelines, which evaluates which is the guidance around how Metro evaluates and designs and changes service. So in a given year or a couple of years ahead, how will we, as there's ability to increase or if needed to reduce our service, where are those service hours going to be going to happen, service change is going to happen. And let's see. And so as I mentioned, these are right now, they've just been, this summer they were transmitted to King County Council and the Regional Transit Committee. They just recently were heard and discussed, and this fall and winter, they will be discussed by these two bodies, voted on, and hopefully adopted by the end of the year. For those less familiar, the Regional Transit Committee is a body of elected leaders from jurisdictions around King County. It's made up of some King County council members, some Seattle City council members, and then council members from other jurisdictions in King County. And they're really charged with developing recommendations to the county council on public transportation policies. Then it will be heard by the Mobility and Environment Committee. So what we're sharing specifically about these policies today are those that have been proposed. That King County's climate commitments and the strategic climate action plan has already been adopted by council. So next I'm going to go into each of those policies and a kind of light touch, really focusing in on how we're aligning with the climate commitments, but I'm happy to just pause there to context questions, or and I want to talk about each of those policies, but I could go back and talk more about the specific climate commitments, but just a check of the room for a moment here.
Hi, Carrie, I had a question.
Yep.
So in your original graph that you showed, it looked like, for instance, the car trips line went down at to 2030, and then it was sort of flat between 2030 and 2050. Why is that?
Well, the that particular wedge, and what's most important, and we could go back to this, is sort of the size of the wedge, because they're each kind of stacked, right? So that wedge assumes, and this is now King County, you know, our goal for the region is that the region will see a reduction in vehicle miles traveled of passenger cars and light trucks by 20% by 2030 and by 28% by 2050 total VMT. That kind of compares to like a per capita reduction in VMT of 50% by 2050. So those are the numbers behind it. I can't exactly tell you why. Anyway, it looks what it is, but those are in line with what was adopted by the Washington State Legislature, the VMT reduction.
Okay, so there's no particular event that happens in 2030 that makes it
no.
level
I think
off.
what you're seeing is like the way the other wedges fall through, and some of those relate to it. Like we look that, but it's a little, anyway. It's sort of the width of it.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Jeff, I see you have your hands up.
Yeah, I have my hand up. So I was looking at the graph and the wedges, and I was trying to figure out mentally to myself what is in control of King County, King County government in terms of moving those wedges. And the item that popped up, at least to me, is, the vehicles miles traveled is something I'm sure we're going to talk about more in the future. And I want to ask ahead of time, level set us in terms of electrical bus plan. But I also wanted to ask here, what's the assumptions in terms of the electric vehicles? Because I think that's something that is, at least what you're showing here, is very minimal adoption by 2030, but I think we're going to try and move that forward a little bit. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that and maybe some of the ideas or plans that the county has with, building electric vehicle infrastructure out?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I was remiss in not speaking to that wedge. So one of the other wedges is increase adoption of electric vehicles, and that's countywide. So we both have a commitment in our own fleet and operations that Metro's bus fleet will be entirely zero emission by 2035. And then we also have specific targets around the adoption of electric vehicles countywide. And I can, can talk about some of the specific things that we're focused on. And we are very cognizant of the point you make about what is the role of King County. There are ways that we have kind of more direct engagement and can implement things, and others that are more of a convening function or an advocating function. Is there any other?
So this is Stephanie. I put something in the chat that folks can refer to later. It talks about our electric bus materials and future and all of that jazz. So something to check out for later.
Thank you, Stephanie. Okay. All right. With that, I'll want to talk about the specific policies that Metro is in the middle of updating now. Oh,
sorry, Carl has his hand up.
Oh, thank you. Go ahead.
Carl?
I was muted on Zoom. I was just going to note, to answer the previous question, that we're not projected to globally surpass more than 30% electric vehicle penetration by 2030.
Thanks, that's helpful context. And I can pull up our specific goals too. We could compare that. Okay. All right. So specifically, Metro's strategic plan. 1 second, let me just. Outlines Metro's goals, strategies, and objectives, how to achieve them, and how to measure our success along the way. And these are the 10 goals that are in our proposed strategic plan. Safety, service quality, stewardship, workforce, access, innovation, investments, transit-oriented communities, sustainability, and engagement. The reference there, Metro Connects, is several one, but those are our 10 goals in the strategic plan. And there are several that that focus and align with our climate commitments, and those related to sustainability, the transportation emissions across the county, metro operational emissions, vehicle miles traveled, green and equitable infrastructure, commitments related to transit-oriented communities, and our investments and service quality. And in the process of updating the strategic plan, those sort of climate goals that I went through at the countywide level are now being incorporated as part of Metro's specific strategic plan. And so there is direct alignment with them. And one of the key components of this is we are developing a public-facing dashboard so that residents and groups like yourselves will be able to find and monitor progress towards these goals at both the countywide and operational scales at more regular intervals as we move towards advancing the 10-year period, but be able to see them. And there is a dashboard that will be launched publicly that is interactive, so you can take a look at this information more readily. Next, I wanted to just give an update of Metro Connects, which is Metro's long-range plan, and that's really committing to articulating our vision for bus service and for mobility services to align with our regional planning that's happening, Vision 2050, and it aims to increase bus service by 70 hours between 2015 and 2040, and improve access throughout the county at all times of day, including priority populations, and really includes specific service quality improvements, critical service supports, and partnership opportunities. And of course, this is our vision. Metro Connects is not yet fully funded, and so additional regional funding will be needed. And specifically, some of the things that have been updated in this update are implementation timelines, so shifting out to align with Vision 2050, the 2050 network and interim network, identifying where there are gaps in the system, where we are not meeting the mobility needs of priority populations in King County, and reevaluating how we prioritize investments in our rapid ride network.
Hey, just real quick, I see
please.
note in the chat. I wasn't sure. Ingrid asks, what are your thoughts about additional regional funding? Ingrid, are you asking the caucus or are you asking Metro?
I'm asking Metro.
Okay. Carrie, do you want to field that or would you like me to field that?
I'd say go for it. Yeah.
All right. I will say that, right before, literally days before COVID hit, the King County Council was putting finishing touches on a regional funding package that would have gone to the voters in the fall of 2020. And, but like literally days before that, after that happened, or before that happened, COVID hit, and suddenly we were all, it kind of threw everything into chaos, as we've all experienced. City of Seattle was able to put in that regional funding measure, and as you might know, it passed 80% this last year, and that's called the Seattle Transportation Benefit District. But there was a little bit in that at what's called the STBD that mentioned that, hey, if there's ever a chance to kind of expand this regionally, we'd be open to hearing about that. And that's something that we're, of course, Metro, we're a transit agency, and we know how much need is out there. According to our system evaluation report that we publish every year, we have hundreds and thousands of hours of unmet need in the system. And so we know that, as Carrie mentioned, our long range vision of called Metro Connects, which is that kind of 20-year, 40-year vision is not going to come to fruition without additional funding. So that's something that is a need for the agency if we do want to fulfill that vision. So it's my, at the most recent RTC meeting, the Regional Transit Committee meeting, the same question came up. What about this regional funding? And when the council chair, Councilor Balducci, made comments saying, "Hey, I'm ready to have that conversation again." So at this point, it's really frankly up to the elected officials to make that determination. They're the ones who would put it on the ballot. They're the ones who are would collectively talk about that. And so, I think for Metro, I mean, we've shown that the need is there, the vision is there, but it would be up to the elected officials to put that on the ballot eventually. So unless somebody did it by initiative. But that, and it sounds, as I said in the last RTC meeting, there was a conversation about that. So we'll see how it goes. But our general manager, Terry White, has definitely talked about this at that very same meeting and many, many times in other venues for the need for fulfilling that vision of Metro Connects, and that's a funding requirement. So I hope that helps answer the question. It's definitely something that's on our mind for the future.
Thanks, Stephanie. Great, thanks, Ingrid. So again, just sort of highlighting some of the ways that this long-range vision for mobility services, for our service in the region, long-term, how we've aligned it with our climate commitments. So Metro Connects now includes integrates our vision for equitable transit-oriented communities program. We know that the way that we achieve those regional VMT targets is a combination of transit service with compact land use that's affordable. It also includes some amount of vehicle usage pricing, but we know so that's now incorporated into Metro Connects. Now the evaluation for where we're going to invest in rapid ride corridors considers the number of new riders that would be gained, or the potential reduction in VMT, as well as the total number of housing and jobs. So sort of the productivity of a corridor. Climate is now an explicit criteria for prioritizing our capital investments. The Metro Connects now affirms and lines up with our commitment around our zero emission fleet. And it articulates our recognition that it's really these three things that go together. As I said, transit service, land use change, and some kind of equitable vehicle pricing to get the behavior change and get to our vision of our goal of reducing VMT. So here's just a snapshot of from Metro Connects. One piece of getting more folks to use transit is having really great transit. And so metric is like, how competitive is transit today relative to driving, and how competitive will it be in the future? So today, in these three sample corridors, Ballard to the U District, Federally to Auburn, downtown Bellevue to downtown Kirkland, transit now will take you twice as long or more than twice as long. We know that twice is sort of beyond that. Folks find other ways to get there, where if Metro Connects was fully implemented, you see these longest corridors travel times being competitive, or a little bit longer, or maybe even a little bit faster, taking transit relative to driving. And then the last policy is our service guidelines. And our service guidelines are really the policy that that gets at how do we make decisions around increasing and allocating service hours, or if needed, service reductions. And this figure here is sort of the priority levels of how we're making decisions about where new service hour investments go. And related to our climate priorities, in the updates, reducing crowding and improving reliability continue to be the top two priorities for service investments. As we grow service in this updated version, equity and then ranking first and land use second, and that priority will be prioritized for growing our system. And also there's now new measures to, in terms of identifying routes for reductions where the productivity of the route is so low that it would be more efficient to even drive a car on that route because of the numbers. So that's something that we're factoring into service decisions. And with that, I'll pause for questions. I have some more slides if there's things that folks like want to anyway dig into some of the more details, but that's the high level. What are the Metro's big picture commitments around climate that we worked with and have been adopted now at King County, and how we have integrated those into our policies, both our strategic plan, our vision for the future, and how we're going to make near term service decisions. And those are proposed, and we're hoping that they are swiftly adopted by our governing bodies, but still to be seen.
I love that enthusiasm.
Yes.
There is a question from Jeff. Several questions regarding a few regarding the ride-free zone. He says, what was the experience of the ride-free zone in Seattle Central Business District? And then also, would bringing that ride-free zone back help with vehicle miles traveled? And then could we use the congestion pricing to make up the revenue loss for the ride-free zone? And are you working with Seattle for dedicated bus lanes so the ride times are consistent? I can tackle the last one. I know a little bit about the ride-free zone, of course, but Carrie, do you have any thoughts about these items, or should we get back to the group?
I would say, why don't you go ahead with the one you were thinking about, and then I can speak to the congestion pricing. I guess I would say in terms of the, one caveat I meant to say at the beginning is that neither Stephanie and I are the sort of service planning folks, and so we're happy to always go back and get specific answers. Of course, the fare and what people pay for transit is one piece of the equation about how often and how that works for folks, and it's something we are thinking about. But go ahead, Stephanie.
Sure. So I would say for the last one, are we working with Seattle for dedicated bus lanes so ride times are consistent? Absolutely. We have a whole team called Speed and Reliability. Those are two of the things that customers want the most. They want speed and reliability, as well as frequency. And so we have a whole team, and speed and reliability has a lot with the city of Seattle and other jurisdictions. Obviously, interestingly enough, Seattle is only a third of the county. So we actually work with 39 cities on various speed and reliability efforts, including working with Seattle on those, you may have seen them, those red bus lanes. They have been cropping up more and more. I know that Seattle had a Move Seattle levy that helped pay for some of those and some other sources of funding. And it's really been a great partnership. Those, having dedicated transit lanes, absolutely, like you imply on this question, is huge in terms of making our transit more efficient, making it more consistent. Riders absolutely, need to get to where they're going in a predictable fashion, and being able to operate outside of traffic is huge. So we've been really successful there. We've also been working with the Washington State Legislature, and when I say we, I mean the county. Metro doesn't directly lobby the state, but we have folks who do that. And we've been asking for ways to increase the efficiency of those, like red light, having cameras to make sure people aren't driving in the bus lanes, because that can often happen. And so we've been working on ways to, there's actually some state laws around those bus lanes. So we've been working with the state to figure that out. And so it definitely is it's a high priority to make sure we keep our system running as smoothly as possible, because we know if it's not reliable, it's not speedy, it isn't dependable, people won't take it, and then we won't have those climate benefits. So that's a huge deal. In terms of the ride-free zone, I don't know if we're able to speak to it sounds like you're talking about the environmental benefits of that zone. It's a good question. I'm not sure if we can speak to that specifically here, but Carrie, can you talk a little bit about congestion pricing in general, maybe?
Could I maybe just give you a little background of where I'm coming from on that, right? So I think one of the things that, there's this question of equity And one of the things that they're saying about equity to raise it is to look at ride-free zones, because that, allows anybody to get on, and you don't need to worry about, special passes or the like. But the question is how do you pay for that, right? And then there's also this question of congestion pricing, which is good from, how do you get vehicle miles traveled down? How do you get people out of cars? And that could be made very equitable if you tie it to increased ride and service. So it seems like there's two things, that if we're trying to push equity, we're trying to decrease vehicle miles traveled. Congestion pricing comes in and really is a good lever, if it's tied to increased bus service. And we did it back. We had that ride-free zone, and then it kind of went away.
Yeah.
Because
And
of
I'm happy
revenue
to-
shortage. And so it's like, okay, this is a way to get revenue back and to increase ridership, deal with the equity issues. Why aren't we talking about that a little bit more? Is kind of why I'm asking that question.
Yeah, I'm happy to just talk about maybe, so the ride-free zone for a long time was something that was paid for, but actually by the city of Seattle. It was a partnership with the city, and we found that, well, let me back up. In terms of sort of the kind of equity and social justice element, there definitely has been an interest in saying, hey, if the fares are free, people will ride, it's great. And that's something that, we've obviously been hearing. One of the challenges there is that, I mentioned earlier, kind of the hundreds of thousands of hours of unmet need in the system. What we often hear from our customers is we want to have frequency. We want the bus to come more often. We want it to go to places that we need it to go. We need it to be more dependable. We need it to be speedier, more reliable. Those are the things we often hear. The cost of the trip can sometimes, is definitely something that we've heard in the past, which is why Metro came up with, or the county came up with Orca Lift, which is a program that some of you may have heard of, which provides a 50% less cost per ride for people who are eligible and a certain income threshold. And that has been huge. Orca Lift has been really well received. We have riders who it makes a huge difference in their lives. And we also have come up with other kinds of, we recently came up with a subsidized annual pass, which is for folks who are on certain state programs who can get a pass that's cost-free to them. And so we have of trying to meet people where they're at and make sure that they are able to, that cost is not a block to riding Metro. But the one, the demand for service is so high. And for us, if we find that when the bus is going where you want it to go, when you want it to, on time, expected, dependable, all those things, people will ride. And we do have programs that that we've implemented that will help address the cost issue. And it is a balance though. There have been agencies across the country who have said, hey, it costs us more to collect fares than it is to issue them, because they only a small percentage of their budget is fares. King County Metro is required to have a 25% fare box recovery in terms of our system. And so we aren't actually able to go below that. And so fares represent, and I have a flyer with those numbers, but it's like over $100 million of service. So it's definitely, it's not insignificant. And so we know, but again, we certainly, as Carrie said at the top of the presentation, mobility is a human right. We want to make sure everybody can have access to public transit, especially the bus. And so and we don't want cost to be a barrier. So we're definitely looking at different ways to make it affordable for those who can afford it, for those who can't afford it. And for those who can, as a lot of Metro customers actually do get free rides from their employer. Receive a tremendous amount of Orca revenue from employers. And so it's actually the companies around King County are paying a tremendous amount, and including institutions as well, like the University of Washington, are paying a tremendous amount in Orca cards for their employees. So we're just trying to balance all of these different elements, but bringing it back to climate, obviously, the more people we can get to choose Metro or choose transit, the better in terms of our climate. And I see there's David Ramsey and Alan have questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to get on to some other folks who have questions. Thank you. Dave?
In terms of emission reductions, what has been the performance results to date?
Sure. Are you speaking about like King County as at the countywide level, or metro operations, or government operations?
I'm particularly interested in metro operations.
Sure. And I can, so Metro has reduced our emissions from our fleet and from our facility energy use. For example, our facility energy use is down 17% from 2014. A lot of our fleet operations, our fleet energy use is down by about 20%. And those are our primary places where we reduce, where emissions come from, our fleet and our facilities. Alan, your question, and then if there, I can go back to sort of this point about congestion pricing if that's of interest, or depending on what folks are interested, I'll stop this. I was pulling that up before. And go ahead, Alan.
Sure. Well, thanks for your presentation. So not surprisingly, I have a question about the role of good transit information and what Metro's plans are. So in terms of supporting the sustainability goals that you've described, I think we should emphasize the role of good information. I mean, it's not a substitute for having, fast buses and so forth. But if I'm given a choice between say a 15-minute headway, and I'm really not sure when the bus is coming, and a 20-minute headway, but I can know very exactly when the bus is coming and when it's going to be late, I'd rather do the 20-minute one, and that's removes a lot of hours of bus service. But in your strategic plan, you didn't actually have anything about transit information, so I'd suggest that as maybe something to add. So here's a couple of specifics. You mentioned dealing with climate disruption. When Metro is on snow reroutes, this doesn't show up in One Bus Away or any of the other transit information. When you land at most, you don't know that the bus is off route and when it's going to come. Maybe another place that could be even better. I appreciate Metro's support for One Bus Away over the years. We're getting $2,000 a year. But for example, for the apps, which are used by hundreds of thousands of people, the iPhone app is done just by a volunteer, in off hours. And these days, there are certainly other places for information, but everybody else is either surveillance capitalism, like Google, or venture capitalist startup funding, and they're not doing it out of nonprofit goodwill. So I think there could be some further support for what we're trying to do as a nonprofit here. Again, I really appreciate what you've done so far. But our role is to push things a little further even.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Carrie, if you can stay another couple of minutes, if you want to touch on the congestion pricing. That
Sure.
would be great, but I don't want to take your whole evening away from you.
Fair enough. Well, I will share because it's one of the things that I think was a real aha for us, and so I want to share it. So I'll share this, and then I will guys go ahead. I kind of mentioned it in terms of what are the ways that we were updating Metro Connects, but we did some modeling work for the region of saying, what would it take to hit that wedge that I showed of the VMT reduction targets of a per capita VMT reduction of 50% by 2050, or a total VMT reduction by 20% by 2050. And what we did working with the consultant team was use the Vision 2050 of what's in that proposed plan in terms of increased service and increased population and job growth and land use as a small vehicle usage pricing as a starting point, and see would that get us to our VMT reduction goals, and it does not. And say then, well, if you had these dials, if you have transit service levels, land use, and you have vehicle usage pricing, if you turn each of them individually? Can you crank really hard and get there? What sort of is kind of the Goldilocks if you do a little bit of all. So what's shown in this figure of this table from the climate plan is that Vision 2050 alone doesn't get you there. That if you just really cranked on transit service, you could get there, but you get some very wonky things that don't make a lot of sense in the real world. Just land use doesn't get there. If you had vehicle pricing alone, you could get there, but again, you get some things that don't make sense. But really, we found is that land use along the levels, that's what's in Vision 2050, will get you there, combined with more transit service and more vehicle usage pricing that is implemented equitably, that there's some level of vehicle usage pricing, whether it's congestion pricing or parking policies or tolling, or and being really cognizant about where that cost burden is landing to get the behavior change, along with really good transit. That is the ingredients together. So it's that combined scenario that's combining all three that's critical to get to that target. And based on those, what King County and specifically Metro is committed to is using our role as a convener and advocate, that we are going to be engaged in the conversation regionally around what does an equitable vehicle usage pricing look like in whatever shape or form. And this conversation has been raised tonight around transit service funding and growth, because we know that our region needs Metro Connects, and that's not fully funded, and we even need more transit service to really deliver on our commitment. So that's one of the ways that some of this we directly implement, but also convening and advocating for those key pieces.
So just to clarify that point, so you're saying adopted regional growth strategy is not a big component if you go with better transit service, vehicle pricing, and trying to increase walk, bike, transit role?
Oh, sort of. No, what we're actually saying is that the adopted regional growth strategy, so that level of land use change is sufficient along with transit service level. So this little dash means like the same as. So same as Vision 2050, plus more transit service than is in Vision 2050, and more vehicle usage pricing than is in 2050 will get you there. That's what this is intended to communicate.
Then I have one last question, which is kind of like, I don't know. I just was wondering if you could touch on COVID impacts, and because it seems like that introduces a lot of unknowns, like unknown what the ridership is going to look like, unknown in terms of work patterns, and yeah, it just introduces some unknowns that may or we don't really know how they're going to resolve themselves. So how is that impacting the things that you were talking about? Like, is this a COVID adjusted presentation, or kind of a continuation of, and assuming that we're going to go back to quote what was normal before COVID?
Yeah, I'll answer with the latter part of your question. And Stephanie, I don't know if I could take a go, but maybe you have kind of ready to go on that one. So county's climate plan, Metro, is part of our commitments, and certainly our value and commitment to addressing climate change has not changed. Like long-term where we need to go doesn't change regardless of COVID, and neither have our goals and strategies. And that was certainly the direction we got from our elected leadership and our agency leadership that were behind this. What it means in the near term of how we get there is changing and adjusting, and it looks different now than it did a year ago when we were finalizing the plan. So this isn't specifically adjusted. I think there's some things like thinking about how our service is all day versus meeting those peak periods and the traditional commuter that we're already thinking about, that we're kind of primed for. I know that we just put a data point in it that typically before the pandemic, Metro served 400,000 customers on an average weekday. And now, starting with especially the school back in session, we're at around 175,000 customers a day. It was at more like 100,000 typically during kind of height of the pandemic. So we are seeing increases in ridership. We are working with our employers and different customers and really thinking about how do we meet the needs and mobility needs and service needs of the region and in the shifting time. And, there's a lot of uncertainty, but Stephanie, I bet you have a thought to add on that.
No, I don't really think I can top that. I think, reiterate, what Metro is really focused on is no matter what, we need to stay aligned with our values, and that's equity and sustainability and making sure we're going where needs are greatest. And we're not, we've been lucky enough. There was a federal funding question, I think, somewhere in the chat. We've been grateful and lucky enough as an agency to receive federal funding to keep our system going during this time. We've been really able to, there are systems that have really seen a tremendous amount of drop off. And for us, being able to keep the buses on the road during the pandemic has been, we're really grateful for that. But, on an average day, pre-pandemic, we were probably had about 450,000 trips each day. So almost 500,000 each day. And right now our September average was 183,000, which is great. We're really grateful for that. But we need to keep it going. And so I think a big focus that we have right now is trying to manage, this pandemic with also trying to get folks to choose transit. And so I think the biggest thing I would say is ride transit. That's going to get us to where we need to go. I know that sounds simplistic, but that's something that we're really focused on. And because we don't want to be in it was truly devastating to actually, after many, many years of increasing service, Metro got a national award for being best agency in the country. And it was a large part to our increased ridership. Very proud of that. And then to be in a situation where we had to drastically reduce service all of a sudden was pretty devastating. So we're really eager and excited to provide great service and encourage and safe service and encourage folks to get back on the bus and back on transit in general. So really, I think that's the big message here.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carrie and Stephanie. This is a great presentation, and we have it recorded, so we'll be sending it out to our larger group. And for the people who were here tonight, it was great to hear you, and thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Perfect. Thank you for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Great. Okay. Let's see. So I'm going to go back to the, go back to the agenda. And, okay. Okay, so the next item is the book club.